Okay, welcome everyone to our program. In case you're looking for Steve, as you just heard, he's at the dentist, and Julia's going to be with her son. So I'll be here to host the program with Pam as my co-host. If you have any comments during the program, please put them in the chat, posted to everyone. If Pam can answer the question, she will. And any questions for Roee, our speaker, will be answered at the end of the program. In terms of updates, just with Volunteers for Israel, I am excited to say that the first group of people is set to go in March. We are doing the VFI Plus archaeology trip that is running March 27th through April 9th. An email has been sent to everyone on the preferred list, which was basically anyone who told me they definitely want to go and want to be on the list. So, and there are 16 spots. I have about 19 people signed up. Some people will inevitably say they can't go anymore or they want to change to a different trip. So if you do want to go, please let me know like now, because I need to give you all the travel information since we are starting to collect. It's like first come, first serve, $500 deposits per person. So let me know if you are interested. So it's a great change. We're really excited. Hopefully there won't be something weird happening in Israel and everything will be canceled. So that is the exciting news. I want to introduce our speaker, Roee. Roee was with us once before, and we're really excited to have him back. He's a senior guide at Yad VaShem and a coordinator of an Israel tour guides course at Wingate Academic College. Roee holds a master's degree from the University of Cambridge. His interest lies in the topic of Israeli and Jewish identity and how central events such as the Holocaust, wars, and conflicts have shaped them. So welcome, Roee. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again. I'm very happy to see all of you again for this meeting. Good afternoon. Over here in Israel, it's good night, but on your side of the ocean, it's good afternoon. So last time we've met, we talked about Mount Herzl, a little bit about Israeli history, Israeli identity, its connection to Jewish history. And today we're going to have a virtual tour on the second part of the same mountain, the Mountain of Remembrance. But we're going to go at least chronologically back in time and speak about Yad VaShem and the Holocaust. And I'm sorry to be the one who always brings you sad and difficult stories. But as you saw last time, and as I hope you will see today as well, I believe that when we deal with such difficult or painful parts of history, then it's important not only to tell the sad parts or the difficult parts, but also to see how can we as a society, we as individuals can get inspiration or thoughts from that history. So without further ado, we're going to go to the
Roee?
Yeah.
Roee?
Yes.
Okay, sorry for interrupting. Since I will be leaving soon, I would like to wish you good luck, and I would like to invite everybody to join us next week, because next week's presentation is connected to this week's presentation, I would say ideologically and geographically, because as you might have told him before, there is a connect between the fighting for the Jewish nation and the Jewish state and the Holocaust. There is a connection between Mount Herzl and Yad VaShem. So next week we will have a wonderful speaker and tour guide, Gadi Ben Dov. I guess you know him, Roee. And Gadi will be talking about the pre-IDF fighters. He will be talking about the underground Jewish movement who fought for the establishment of the state of Israel as it is today. So I'm very happy that these presentations are connected in time, they are connected geographically, and you're so much welcome to join us next week again.
Thank you, Julia. I'm sorry I didn't remember to ask you to do that. Thank you.
Sure. Roee, thank you. All yours.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. As you said, really, it's a connection that is both thematical and geographical, because like I talked last time, for those of you who weren't here, Mount Herzl is one physical mountain in Jerusalem, in Western Jerusalem, that is divided between two different campuses, two different parts. One part is Yad VaShem, the other part is the National Cemetery, the official burial place of Israel's leaders, soldiers who fell in the battles, and also the father of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, who also gave the mountain its name. So indeed, we are talking about two parts of the same story, both in terms of time and history, and also if we would do this on a tour physically on the ground, hopefully very soon, then we actually do this as one tour. So that's what we're doing, actually the second part, or actually the first part of our last meeting. So I'm gonna share my screen with you. And we're gonna start. So Yad VaShem. Let's begin with a couple of words about this institution. I assume that at least some of you had the opportunity to visit Yad VaShem sometime in history. Yad VaShem is the National Holocaust Remembrance Center here in Israel, and it works according to a law, a specific law that was passed in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, in 1953, dedicated specifically to the establishment of Yad VaShem and to defining its missions and its activity. So not a lot of institutions in Israel and not a lot of institutions in the world act according to their own law. So Yad VaShem is one of these. And in this law, the Knesset, the parliament, has decided and put together the missions that Yad VaShem is going to focus on for the rest of its activity. And the first and the most important mission is the collecting of the names of the 6 million victims of the Holocaust. Together, the names, the details, every possible personal detail that we can find. And this mission is something that has been going on for the last few decades. Currently, we have in Yad VaShem archives about 4.5 million names of victims. So even after almost 80 years now, we still have a very large portion of the victims whom are unknown to us. We only know the numbers. We still don't know the names of about a third of the victims. So this process is still going on through historical work, through working with archives, with documents, and mainly by asking people from the general public in Israel and all over the world, Jews and non-Jews, to give us names of people that they know were murdered in the Holocaust, family members, neighbors, people they know, people whose name they came across somehow during their life. And this is how we collect all these names. By the way, this database of names is available online from the Yad VaShem website, and every one of you who is interested in seeing the names, the faces of the people that were killed, you are more than welcome to enter and search this database from the Yad VaShem website at yadvashem.org, and you'll be able to find relatives or just see the people. But in addition to collecting names, Yad VaShem is also a center for commemoration and educational projects. As part of this, we have the Yad VaShem Museum, that I assume that those of you who did have a chance to visit Yad VaShem, you visited the new museum. You can see it here in the middle of the campus, this triangular shaped corridor. This is the new museum that was opened in 2005. But because the museum is very dense and rich with information and artifacts and objects, it is impossible to go through it in one meeting. So I'm not going to even try to go into the museum, into the 10 different galleries with dozens of personal stories, about 100 hours of video, hundreds of artifacts. We're not going to go into the museum. What we are going to do today is focus on the campus, because Yad VaShem is not only the museum, it's an entire campus with many, many different memorials, monuments, statues all around it. And I assume that at least the people who visited the Yad VaShem once mainly focused on the museum, and maybe you didn't have an opportunity to see the other things that we have. So today we're going to focus on everything that is outside of the museum. Except the museum and all the educational projects, Yad VaShem also is in charge of collecting artifacts, photos, documents, being an archive. Yad VaShem has the largest archive in the world about the Holocaust, with more than 75 million books, documents, photos, artifacts, by far the largest in the world. It's also an academic center with researchers from all leading universities of the world coming, doing research, publishing their books, their articles, and for the use of the academic world. And the last mission that Yad VaShem was given in that law from 1953 was to honor the righteous among the nations, those Gentile people who helped and saved Jews during the Holocaust while risking their lives and while not receiving anything or not asking anything in return for this. And we're going to see how they are commemorated. So these are the things that Yad VaShem is doing. And like I said, we're going to start and look at Yad VaShem through the different memorials and monuments that we have around the mountain. Now, as we look at these monuments, we're also going to look at a few things that a memorial, any memorial in the world, can teach us. Because a memorial is not just a statue. A memorial is part of general commemoration, as part of a collective memory. A memorial is many times a place of ceremonies. A memorial is a place of being together with the memory of people that we know or people that we don't know personally, but we do care about. So a memorial tells a story. And actually, I'm going to try to show you that a memorial, every memorial in the world, not only those in Yad VaShem, every memorial in the world can tell us three different stories, or they can be very similar, but there are three separate stories. The first story that any memorial can teach us is a story of the historical event that it commemorates. Every memorial commemorates something, so we can learn about that something from the memorial. The second story every memorial in the world teaches us is the story of the people who built the memorial. Memorials don't just happen in the world. People build them, establish them, design them. And these memorials are also a product of their creating society, the people, the values of the people who created the memorial. For our purpose today, this is going to be the Israeli society, because most of the memorials we're going to speak about were created by Israelis in Israel. But the third story that every memorial in the world can teach us is a story about ourselves, the people who look at the memorial, the people who come to the memorial. Why do we come there? What do we feel when we see or speak about the memorial? What feelings does it bring to us? What thoughts does it bring to us? Do we agree with the memorial, or do we disagree with it? Do we feel comfortable or uncomfortable with it? So we're going to focus on or touch all these three different circles or different stories through some of these memorials. So let's start with the first one. It is called the Hall of Remembrance, and it is the first memorial that was built in Yad VaShem, the one that inaugurated the site already in the late 50s, early 1960s. And the Hall of Remembrance, you can see that when we look from the outside, it is built like a very big cube, square cube. The lower part is made of black, very dark basalt stones brought from the north of Israel. The top part is made of concrete, raw concrete, unembellished, not decorated, very rough, very blunt. And like this, the memory of the Holocaust is also something that you cannot beautify, you cannot do some touch-ups and makeup on it. It's very tough, it's hard, it's difficult, and it's going to stay there in our faces, in our memory, in our thoughts forever. Now, in Hebrew, this hall is called the memorial tent. Ohel is called. The word in Hebrew sounds very similar to Ohel Moed, the tent of the Israelites, the temple, the tabernacle that the Israelites carried with them in the desert. So it connects us through the word, through the naming, to Jewish history, to Jewish traditions, to how Jewish people keep their most important, their most sacred things. But at the same time, if you think about the tent, if I didn't show you that picture and I ask you to think about a tent, I'm sure that this is not what you would think about. When we think about tent, we think about something easy, something light, something from cloth or light materials. We don't think about concrete and stone. But this tent that connects to our past is a tent that is there to stay. It's a fixed tent, present, stable, not going to disappear. Just like we want the memory of the Holocaust to continue and be present all the time. When you enter the Hall of Remembrance, what you see inside is, first of all, the eternal flame over here, that of course commemorates the people, the people that were murdered. Here you can see a stone slab under which we buried ashes brought here from 6 different places where Jews were killed. And this is the only place in Yad VaShem where there are physical remains of the victims, not artifacts, not documents, not pictures, but physical remains. And this is why this entire hall is treated like a cemetery, because some of the victims, the remains of some of the victims, is actually buried here. On the floor, you have the names of a few of the extermination places, camps, the ghettos, deportation camps, execution sites. Of course, just a few of the most known names, and not all of them, because there are tens of thousands of names, but the most known and famous places. At the top, on the ceiling, is, you can see, shaped like a tent, sort of a pyramid shape with a hole at the top that brings natural daylight. The sun comes inside. And even though the atmosphere inside is very dark, very solemn, you still have light coming through. You still have hope. You still have a ray of sun, even a small one, that comes and shines inside this big darkness. This memorial is also the official commemoration site, and every time official delegates, heads of state, or any important person come to visit Yad VaShem, this is where they have ceremonies. So you can see here the last 3 American presidents. President Biden has visited Yad VaShem, but as a vice president, not yet as a president. I'm sure that during his first visit to Israel, whenever it happens, he will, of course, come also to Yad VaShem. You can see here German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who visited Yad VaShem 5 times during her term. You can see the Pope Francis visiting the Hall of Remembrance. Indian Prime Minister Modi. So every official delegate that comes to Israel comes to Yad VaShem. This is part of the protocol of every official visit. You know that in some countries, they have the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier or similar commemoration sites that every official delegate comes to. In Israel, we don't have such a thing. The similar thing we have is Yad VaShem. So every leader comes and pays the respect in the Hall of Remembrance. Now, I think that when you see this memorial, I think that the feelings that most people have when they visit here or see this place, the story that this memorial tells us, there is first of all the story of the extermination. the names of the places of extermination, the remains of the people, so the fact that people were killed. So we learn about the historical event. The other story said is the story of the people who established the monument. And this memorial was designed during the 1950s. It was the construction was over at the beginning of the 1960s. And in that time in Israel, the Holocaust was a very unspoken subject. It was considered almost an embarrassing part of history. It's very difficult to imagine this today, but for the early Israeli society, they were focused on building the new Jew. This was the project of Zionism, establishing the new kind of Jew, a strong, independent, a powerful Jew that stands for itself, has rights in the world. And the old world, the European Jewry, were considered by many of the early Zionists as old Jews, people who belong to the old identity, weak Jews who cannot stand for their rights, who only wait for the blow to come on them. And the Holocaust was considered the most obvious example of what happens to the Jewish people if we keep the old identity. The Holocaust was the best example of why we need to leave behind the old Jewish identity and create a new Jewish identity. So the early Israeli society did not want to deal with the Holocaust. They were busy, in addition to this conceptual thing, they were also busy in building a new state. Israel in its early years had so many challenges, so many difficulties, wars and an economic crisis and social crisis and absorbing the aliyahs, the immigrations. So who has time in such a situation to deal with the history, with the past, especially a past which was considered not the best showcase of our people? So this is why in the 1950s to the early 60s, Israeli society did not speak about the Holocaust. And this is why many of the survivors in the early years did not tell their stories. For them, it was telling your story means reliving it again, reliving the trauma, but also, in addition to the difficulty of telling, I think that the more important thing is that in the 1950s in Israel, there wasn't really someone who was willing to listen. And that's why we can give the headline to the early years as the big silence, because the people did not deny the Holocaust, of course, but that's not what we want to teach our children. This is not what we want to have at the center of our identity. We have other episodes in our history that we do want to put in the center. So this is the atmosphere of the 1950s. If we move to the next memorial, which brings us to the early 60s, this is called the Pillar of Bravery. You can see that it's a very high pillar, very tall pillar of steel. On both sides, you have these black stones. And if you think about something that is divided to two sides, and the pillar in the middle leading us, I'm sure that some of you already have the image of the Exodus from Egypt, the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke that led the people of Israel out of Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea for the Israelites to pass through it. So these are the feelings or the connections that this memorial seeks to bring. Who is the leading pillar? Who are the people who lead? Who are the images? Who are the figures that lead the new Jewish people out of the new Egypt? We're going to focus a little bit more, and you'll see that there is an inscription written on the pillar. And this is its translation to English. To the sanctifiers of God's name, to the rebels in the ghettos, to the fighters in the forests, to the rebels in the camps, to the fighters in the underground movements, to the soldiers in the armies, to the rescuers of brothers, to the brave men of the immigration, heroes of might and rebellion for eternal life. So this is a pillar dedicated to bravery, to people who were considered brave, because the brave, the heroes, These are the people who lead the nation out of the new Egypt, out of Europe into the promised land of Israel. But who are the brave people? Who is considered brave? What is considered as heroism in the 1960s? These are the definitions. You can see that these are different ways of speaking about someone who is fighting. Bravery was considered only fighting, taking up arms and fighting against the Nazis or fighting against their collaborators. And only if you took up arms against the Nazis, you can be considered someone who opposed the Nazis. And this divides immediately the population or the survivors or the victims into two parts. Because in the 1960s, the Israeli society saw the Holocaust in terms of black and white. Either you did what you were, either you did the good things or you did bad things. Either you resisted the Nazis or collaborated with Nazis. There is no middle. There is no gray. There is no other way. And the people who did the good things, the braves, the heroes, the people who did the correct action are only these people. The rest of the people went like sheep to slaughter. And by this, in the eyes of the Israeli society of the 1960s, the rest of the people, in a way, assisted the Nazis. Maybe not actively, definitely not willingly. But if you didn't resist the Nazis, you actually helped them. You helped them achieve their goals. And this very dichotomic portrayal of the victims of the Holocaust is something that was very characteristic of the early 60s. One of the events that influenced this perception was the Eichmann trial in 1961, when Israel caught Adolf Eichmann in Argentina, brought him to justice in Israel, one of the leading Nazis. He was put to trial in Israel and he received the death penalty, the only person in Israel to ever, until today, receive the death penalty. And this trial in 1961 changed completely the perspective of the society towards the Holocaust, because for an entire year that the trial went on, all the deliberations, all the meetings of the court were broadcasted on the radio. Not a lot of television back then in Israel, but over the radio, and people came every day from work and listened to hours and hours of court deliberations talking about the Holocaust, with 106 witnesses giving their testimonies, telling their stories. And this was the first time since the end of the Holocaust that the Israeli society sat down and really listened. Not only heard, but listened to their victims, listened to the survivors, heard their stories. And the Israeli society, when they first really intentionally listened to these stories, we see a society in shock. A society that suddenly, almost out of the blue, understand what is this disaster that these survivors have been talking about for all this last decade. What are the difficulties that they were describing? How difficult was life? How impossible was survival? And suddenly everything changes. And suddenly the Holocaust becomes almost overnight, from a side issue, quite an embarrassing part of our history, into the central pillar of our identity. Like a sun, if you want, that shines from above, that touches everything, every object, every person, everything. The Holocaust is relevant for everything. But the sun is also something that is very remote and far away. And we as humans cannot touch the sun because we would get burned. So the Holocaust becomes something very central, but something that you cannot ask questions about. You cannot doubt. You cannot doubt, not in the sense of denying the Holocaust, casting doubt in the terms of asking people questions, speaking with the victims. The victims were considered as martyrs, as saints, as people who are almost inhuman. And the important event of the 1960s is, of course, the Six-Day War, when Israel society suffers a great tragedy on one side, but a great victory at the same time. Many soldiers, many families lost their loved ones, but also a great victory was won. So the importance of fighting, the idealization of fighting of the army was at its peak at this time. So one of the people who were considered one of the biggest brave and heroes of that time is Aharon Lipskind. His nickname is Dolek. Aharon Lipskind was the leader of the Akiba youth movement. Don't confuse with Bnei Akiva, which is active today. The Akiba youth movement was a Jewish Zionist movement in Eastern Europe. And he was the head of the movement in Krakow, in southern Poland. And when the Krakow ghetto is established and all the Jews of Krakow are sent into the ghetto, Dolek, together with the other activists of the movement, you can see their pictures and their names here, they begin to be active with the youth, organize the youth, help the young people of the ghetto get clothes, get food into the ghetto. But eventually they understand that getting social help, food, clothes, that's not enough. They need to do something more. They want to do something against the Nazis. And eventually they decide on December 1942 to put a fight against the Nazis, and they're able to blow up one of the restaurants where many Nazi soldiers used to dine. They burned the main SS car facilities in Krakow, and during this single night, the entire city is almost on fire with this activity organized by the Akiba movement, headed by Dolek Lipskind and his friends. Eventually, the Nazis retaliate for this, and they hunt them down, and all of the leaders were exterminated in the camps or shot or otherwise executed by the Nazis and paid with their lives. But Shimshon Drenger, that you can see here, his picture, he used to write the movement's newspaper. And in his newspaper, he describes some of the events leading to this rebellion in Krakow. And he writes that one day when they were sitting with Dolek, at the head of the movement, they asked him, why? Why do we choose this path that will lead to our death? No question about it. They had no illusions what's going to be the outcome. And Dolek answered them in a very interesting sentence. And he tells them that we're not fighting in order to win. We are just a few teenagers. We have no power, no possibility to win over the Nazis. We cannot undo the ghetto. We cannot finish the war. We cannot eradicate Germany. But we are fighting because someday, many years in the future, there would be a child somewhere in the world sitting, and that child is going to read a history book about our lifetime, about the Second World War. And we are fighting so that in that book, there would be 3 lines about us. He said, we are fighting for 3 lines in history so that no one would say that the Jewish youth went like sheep to slaughter. And he says this in November 1942. To remind you, the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion happened almost half a year later, because the activity of the Akiba movement in Krakow in December 42, this was the first armed resistance in Europe against the Nazis. And I think it's amazing to see that these people, the young people, the people who still have their whole future ahead of them, these are the people who found the power to fight against the Nazis and to do the first action that led the way, created the path for all the future activities against the Nazis. So Dolek Lipskind and all the other leaders of the Akiba movement definitely are part of the heroism of the Jewish people in the Second World War. The next memorial I want to show you actually begins in Warsaw, not in Yad VaShem. If you visit Warsaw, I'm sure that you saw this. It's called the Rappaport Memorial, after Nathan Rappaport, the man who designed it and the sculptor who created it. It was inaugurated on the 19th of April, 1946. It's the immediately after the war. You can see that when it's inaugurated, the entire city is still in ruins. This is the middle of the Warsaw Ghetto, the former Jewish Warsaw Ghetto. And this is one of the first memorials in the world about the Holocaust. And a few years later, Rappaport gave Yad VaShem a copy of this memorial as a present. And this memorial was put in the 1970s in Yad VaShem, and you can see it here. This is the main square dedicated to the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion, and the main memorial is here. But you can see that it looks a little different. This is where all the official ceremonies take place every year during the commemoration day for the Holocaust. This is where the main ceremony takes place with the president and prime minister and all the other important people. So let's take a closer look at this memorial. It has two parts. One part speaks about the extermination. You can see here a row of people, a row of Jews walking towards their death. You can see here 4 generations. You can see an older person, you can see parents, you can see children. And the 4th generation is because this woman is pregnant with the next generation. This symbolizes that the Nazis were trying to eradicate the entire Jewish population, past, present, and future. You can see that the last person in the line looks backwards, because this is not just this group of a dozen or so people. There is a continuation. This is just part of a very long line of Jews being led to their death. Who is leading them to their death? On first sight, we don't see the perpetrators. But if you look carefully, you can see here the German helmets. You can see their bayonets. You can see that Rappaport, the sculptor, decided to show the Germans, to show the perpetrators, but only as a hint, not as the main thing. But this depiction is almost flat. It's just very tiny variations in the depth. You can see that it's parallel to the ground, and almost all the people look down, except one person who holds the Torah. He's only one looking up. The rest of them are looking down. And just next to this relief, we have the second part of the memorial. You can see that it looks completely different. Here you have tall figures standing up, all of them looking up. You can see the fire of the burning ghetto behind them. You can see that every single one of them holds some kind of arms or ammunition, a hand grenade, a rifle, a stone, a knife, something. And they are fighting. These are the fighters. You can see here the 2 different parts of the story. But if I told you that the memorial looks a little different from the original one, even though it's a copy, I'm taking it just for a moment to the original. You can see that here, it's actually 2 sides. On the front of the memorial, you can see the rebellions, the fighters. The other relief is at the back side. So these 2 stories here in Warsaw, in the original, are 2 opposite sides of the story. You're either here or here. But when we come to the 1970s in Israel, you can see that they are now side by side. They're not opposing each other. These are 2 parts of the same story that complete each other, that benefit each other, that complement each other. Because in the 1970s, Israeli society is in a different place. This is after the Yom Kippur War, the trauma of almost destruction of the state of Israel. Every family lost members. Every family, every person felt the feeling of imminent destruction, imminent death, imminent eradication of Israel. And suddenly from this understanding comes an observation of the Holocaust, looking at the Holocaust not as good guys and bad guys, not as black and white, but as a complex issue, a complex part of history with people who made all kinds of decisions, all kinds of choices. And we cannot differentiate good choices and bad choices. We can only look at them and either identify or appreciate them. But we have two parts of this story. So I'm taking you now forward in the history into the 1980s, the late 1980s. And we come to a different story, and this is the Partisans Observatory in Yad VaShem. You can see that from this observatory, you can see the landscape of Jerusalem, the Jerusalem mountains, and in the middle of the observatory, there is a tree made from steel, from iron. This iron metal tree is very interesting, because you look, it's a very nice tree with branches, with leaves, but if you look carefully and come closer, you can see that the thing that builds this tree are actually human figures, people. Because when we speak about the partisans, the partisan movement, the tree is a very important aspect. They lived in the forest of Eastern Europe. They fought in the forest, but they were human beings. They were not just random object or inanimate object. They were human beings. And I think that one partisan that really shows us this aspect is Alexander Bogan. Alexander Bogan was born in Lithuania, and he escaped one of the ghettos, one of the smaller ghettos in Lithuania, into the forest of Lithuania and Belarusia. Alexander was able to join a partisan movement even though he was Jewish, because we need to remember that many of the partisan groups were also anti-Semitic. Not all of the partisans supported the Jews and liked the Jews. Many of them were anti-Semitic, many of them did not like Jews, many of them harmed Jews and killed Jews along the way, or just robbed them. But some of the partisans, some of the groups, some of the leaders were not like that. Some of them supported Jews who escaped from the ghettos. Some of them accepted Jews who escaped from the ghettos. And Alexander did find such a unit and became part of the partisans. But Alexander was not only a fighter and a rebel and a partisan, he was also a painter. He knew how to draw. And while he was in the forest, he would find a piece of cloth or a piece of paper and some charcoal, and he would draw the things that he sees, the life of the partisans. So you can see them sitting here, preparing for battle, taking care of their ammunition and guns. You can see them leading into battle. But I think that the interesting in Alexander's drawing that he doesn't only show us the heroic and the wonderful and the leading role of the partisan, but he also shows us the tired partisan who didn't eat for 3 days because there was nothing in the forest to find. The partisan that can barely walk anymore because he has been escaping from Nazi persecution or Nazi soldiers for a few days without being able to stay and sleep somewhere. So the human side of the partisan movement. And I think that the tragic story of the partisan movement is that when most of the Jews were still able, at least in theory, to escape the ghettos, let's say 1941, 1942, 1943, the partisan movement was still a very young one, and it was not possible for this movement to accept you, to support you, to sustain families or women or children. But when the partisan movement was strong enough and established enough in Eastern Europe to sustain escapees, to help Jews who escaped from the ghettos and even families, and we are talking about late 43, 44, maybe beginning of 45, at this time, in these areas, there were no more Jews left to escape and to join the partisans. So that's maybe the tragedy of this movement. And Alexander tells us this, his feeling towards this tragedy when eventually he entered with his unit into what used to be the Vilna ghetto, the neighborhood that used to be the ghetto. And when they enter the area that is now liberated, he tells us, he writes, that he saw a girl, a young girl, 5, 6, 7 years old, coming out of one of the ruined shelters. And Alexander tells that he was looking at this Jewish girl who somehow survived. And he felt so bad for her. He felt so bad for him, for himself. Why didn't I come earlier? How come I wasn't able to help her? Was there another thing I could have done? And he said that he felt so paralyzed that the only thing he could do in that moment was to draw her. And he draws this young Jewish girl with her doll. And this is the small memory that he leaves from this girl. So this is Bogan and the partisan movement. You can see that we really see, if we look a little deeper, we can see the people, the humans in this movement. Just next to the partisan movement in Yad VaShem, or the partisan observation in Yad VaShem, we have one of the most famous memorials in Yad VaShem, the Kettle car memorial, or the Deportees memorial. This is an original kettle car given to Yad VaShem by the Polish government after the war. We're talking about the early 1990s. And it was put here on this bridge, or part of a bridge that was constructed as part of the memorial. You can see that the kettle car stands at the edge of the bridge. The bridge, even though you cannot really see from this angle, is cut very violently, as if it exploded or as if it was cut by a sword, symbolizing the violent death, the violent end that awaits the people inside the kettle car. And this single kettle car symbolizes or commemorates all the millions of Jews that were sent in similar kettle cars from the ghettos and from their homes to the death camps, to the Nazi death camps. Now, when you stand there and you look at this memorial, you're standing here, you can see the railing over here. And I think it's interesting to compare this memorial to a very similar kettle car that was put on display almost at the same time, early 1990s, on the other side of the ocean, on your side of the ocean, in the Washington Memorial Museum, which exactly at the same time as Yad VaShem received a kettle car and wanted to present it. And I assume that some of you had the opportunity to visit the Washington Memorial Museum, and you may remember that when you visit the Washington Memorial Museum, you walk through the kettle car, you walk into it. The idea is to show people how the kettle cars looked inside, maybe give them the opportunity to feel what it felt inside, or to connect to the ideas inside. But Yad VaShem in 1990 had a completely different approach. They said, time is passing. We grow further and further from the events. It's true that we can speak with the people. We can hear stories. We can read books. We can read testimonies. We can watch films. But we, now, in the 1990s, we in the beginning almost of the 21st century, we can never feel what it feels like to be inside a kettle car train. We can imagine, we can think, we can contemplate. But I here cannot put myself in the shoes of that Jew who stood inside this kettle car. We are in different places, and thank God for that. So Yad VaShem decided to put the kettle car in a place that is unapproachable. You cannot go into it, you cannot touch it, but it's very close. You can see it's just maybe 10 feet or so from where you're standing. So you can see it, you can think about it, you can read about it, but you cannot enter. There's still a gap between us and the Holocaust. The next memorial I want to show is not very big. It's quite a small statue, but I think it's very interesting. This is a memorial dedicated to the 4 heroines of the Auschwitz Jewish resistance. And I assume that some of you might be scratching your head now and saying, a Jewish resistance in Auschwitz? I've never heard about it. But yes, this is one of the less known stories that in Auschwitz, there was a Jewish resistance movement. This resistance movement was active for a few years, and eventually this movement contacts 4 women. Their leader is Roee Peled. Roee Peled was 22 years old at the time. She's a Jewish prisoner in Auschwitz, and she and her fellow inmates are working in the ammunition factory, the German ammunition factory in Auschwitz, producing bombs and shells for the Germans as forced labor, of course. And the Jewish underground in Auschwitz asked Roee and her friends to smuggle gunpowder from the factory. Of course, this means risking their life, because if the Nazis would catch them even trying to smuggle ammunition out of the factory, they would be executed. But Roee and her 3 friends are able to smuggle tiny bits of gunpowder, putting a handful in their pocket every few days, or shoving some of this gunpowder into their shoes. And like this, tiny bit after tiny bit, they're able to smuggle this gunpowder out of the factory and into the hands of the Jewish resistance movement. And eventually, in October 1944, the Jewish resistance begins a rebellion inside Auschwitz. They give this ammunition to the Sonderkommando, the Jewish workforce that was performing the most horrible work, which is to operate the gas chambers for the Nazis. And these Jews of the Sonderkommando, the special workforce, are able to blow up one of the 4 crematoria, one of the 4 gas chambers of Auschwitz. Some of them try to escape, but eventually the Nazis catch all of them, and all of them are executed. In order to find out how these inmates got their gunpowder and their ammunition, the Nazis begin to interrogate people and search and torture people in order to give them information. And eventually they capture Roee Peled and her 3 friends. And their names are Mala Gertner, Esther Weissblum, and Regina Sapperstein. And the 4 of them are interrogated, tortured, and eventually they are executed. They are executed in front of the entire camp in the early January of 1945. And just a few hours after the execution of Roee Peled and her fellow inmates who helped to create this resistance movement, just a few hours after the execution comes an order to the Nazi soldiers to evacuate Auschwitz. And Roee Peled and her 3 friends were the last people executed by the Nazis in Auschwitz. So you can see another story of heroism, of bravery, of women, of young women in Auschwitz in the lowest place possible. But I want to show you now a completely different kind of memorial. And this is the children's memorial. It was established in the late 80s, early 90s, with the help of Abraham and Edith Spiegel from the US. Abraham and Edith Spiegel arrived to Auschwitz in 1944 from Hungary, together with their 3-year-old son called Uziel, and together with Edith's mother. And while they were standing in line for the selection in Auschwitz, someone came to Edith and whispered in her ear, "If you want to live, give your child to someone else." And Edith is now faced with the most horrible dilemma of a mother. Does she give her son to someone else? And Edith chose eventually to give Uziel to her mother. She believed that with his grandmother, Uziel will be safe. Someone will take care of him. Someone will be with him. But as we know, all the elderly and children were sent immediately to the gas chambers in Auschwitz. And Uziel, together with his grandmother, were killed on the very same day they arrived in Auschwitz. Abraham and Edith survived Auschwitz as forced laborers, and they went and rebuilt their lives in Beverly Hills in California. And eventually they came to Yad VaShem and wanted to establish a memorial to Uziel. But together with Yad VaShem, it was decided that this would be a memorial not only to Uziel himself, but to all the 1.5 million children that were killed in the Holocaust. So when you enter the memorial, like this woman here, you walk downstairs, and the first thing you see is the face of Uziel carved in stone. And when you enter the room, the dark room, which is the center of the memorial, you see a single candlelight. And this single candle is reflected in mirrors all around you. And it looks like millions of stars, millions of candles above you, below you, all around you. Each star, each candle is like a child. Each candle is one soul. At the background in this room, they read out loud names of children that were killed. For every child, they read their name, the age when they were killed, and the country that they come from. They read it in Hebrew, in English, and in Yiddish. And this memorial from the late 80s, early 90s, I think shows you a completely different perception of the Holocaust. Because in the Hall of Remembrance that we saw, the first memorial, you saw that there were no names, no faces. The story was a collective story of the Holocaust, a national story. Here, in the 80s and 90s, we see that the Holocaust, the remembrance of the Holocaust, turns into a personal experience. We see faces, we hear names, people have identities, not only as Jews, not only as part of a collective, but also individual identities. And if we speak about children, then of course, just outside the Children's Memorial, there is a memorial to Janusz Korczak, the famous educator who went with his children to the death in Treblinka. It's interesting to compare to the memorial for him in Warsaw. When you see that in Warsaw, he's a tall figure holding the little children. But here in Yad VaShem, you can see that Janusz Korczak, who is the large face here, he's the same height as the children. He's holding them, hugging them, protecting them. And because Korczak believed that he's equal to the children. You say a child, the only difference between a child and an adult is experience. Children are not less important, they're not less smart, they don't have less understanding. They're just like us. They just don't have experience in the world. But we should treat children as equal to us. And Korczak is, of course, a very famous figure, and I assume that almost everybody here between us heard the name of Janusz Korczak. But I assume that most of us haven't heard about his partner in his educational career. Not a personal partner, but professional partner. This is Stefa Wilczynska, who was together with him at every step of the road. Stefa helped him to develop his ideology. Stefa helped to manage the orphanage in Warsaw before the war and during the Warsaw Ghetto. Stefa was with Korczak when they were given the option to escape. Stefa was with Korczak when they decided to go with the children to Treblinka, and Stefa was with them when they arrived to Treblinka, and all of them were killed. And I think it's important to give at least also some place in our memory also to the people who are sometimes behind the scenes, to the people who helped and support the main figures, the main people in the story. almost last thing I want to mention are the righteous among the nations. We said that Yad VaShem commemorates also the Gentiles, the non-Jews that helped and assisted Jews during the Holocaust. The main way we do it is by planting trees in their name, and this is the main avenue of the trees dedicated to the righteous among the nations. Under every tree, there is a plaque with the name of the specific righteous to which this tree is dedicated. But after the entire mountain was covered with trees, and we still continue to find more people, more stories of such people, we decided to establish the garden of the righteous among the nations in Yad VaShem. And here on these walls, all over the garden, you can see the names of all the 27,000 people recognized until today as righteous among the nations. Some are still being recognized today. You can see here, this is a ceremony where a relative of Martha Sharp receives the title of Righteous Among the Nation. She's an American, one of few American Righteous Among the Nations. So this story also is an ongoing project. Another valley or garden that we have is the Valley of the Communities, which is kind of a maze that has many different walls. And on the walls of these courtyards, there are the names of communities, Jewish communities that were either eradicated or harmed by the Nazis. And people can look for the original community, the town, the city where their family comes from. They can light a candle, they can sing, they can pray, they can contemplate. And this is a way to connect to your personal history, to your personal family history, and not only to the general story. The verse in the Bible, or the story in the Bible that gave the inspiration to the Valley of the Communities comes from Ezekiel. And this is the story or the vision of the Valley of the Bones, where Ezekiel tells us that the hand of the Lord had been on me, and he took me out in the spirit of the Lord and put me down in the middle of a valley. And it was full of bones, and they were very dry. And again, he said to me that the Lord, be a prophet to these bones, and at my words there was a shaking of the earth, and the bones came together, bone to bone, and looking, I saw that there were muscles on them, and flesh came up, and they were covered with skin, and breath came into them, and they came to life, and got up on their feet, a very great army. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are all the children of Israel. And see, they are saying, our bones have become dry, our hope is gone. We are cut off completely. For this cause, be a prophet to them and say, this is what the Lord has said. See, I am opening your resting places of the resting places of your dead, and I will make you come up out of your resting places, O my people, and I will take you into the land of Israel. So this prophecy for the Jews in exile in Babylon was the inspiration for the Valley of the Communities, for the Jews in exile in Europe, for the dry bones of the dead communities, the killed communities, the almost extinct nation. But this nation, these dry bones, will one day rise up, put flesh, put skin, breath will come into them, and they will come to the land of Israel. And like the prophecy, if you come in the right season, between the dry bones of the names of the communities, you can see the cyclamen, the national flower of Israel, blossoming from within the stones, symboling the new life, a new building of the people of Israel. So I want to finish, with the last story. This is the story of Peter Gintz, who was 14 years old when he was sent by the Nazis to the Theresienstadt ghetto in Czechoslovakia. Peter was a very gifted painter, and you can see that he drew a lot of drawings. One very famous one is this one called The Face of the Moon, or The Landscape of the Moon, because Peter dreamt of being an astronaut. So he drew how he thinks the face of the moon looks like if you're standing on the face of the moon and looking to the earth. Remember that this is 1943, 44, before Neil Armstrong. No human being has set foot on the moon yet. But Peter imagines. He wants to be an astronaut. Peter, unfortunately, did not survive the Holocaust. He was killed by the Nazis in Auschwitz in 1944. But quite a few decades later, when Ilan Ramon was chosen as the first Israeli astronaut, he chose one thing to take with him to outer space. And that object was this drawing of Peter Gintz, the face of the moon. And he went on board Space Shuttle Columbia with his drawing to outer space. Unfortunately, the space shuttle crashed on its way back to Earth, killing Ilan Ramon and the other 7 American astronauts. But I think it's interesting to see that after 70 years, Peter Gintz's live stream came true. And when an Israeli astronaut flew to space, even though astronauts are the greatest symbol of technology, modernity, the future, when an Israeli astronaut flies to space, when a Jewish astronaut flies to space, it's clear to them that they take with them something symbolic, something small, to connect them also to their past. This story is commemorated in Yad VaShem through a garden, not a statue, not stone, but a garden with plants, with flowers. And this sign over here says that this is dedicated to Peter Gintz and to Ilan Ramon. And this garden with life is another way of commemorating. So I think we saw different kinds of commemoration in every generation. Every generation perceived the Holocaust in a different way. Every generation made different stresses in the memory, in the commemoration of the Holocaust. For every generation, the Holocaust meant something else. They wanted to use it or interpret it in different ways. We saw commemoration in stone, in concrete, in wood, in other materials, and also in recent years, because this is 2006, in the recent years also commemorating with plants, with living things. And the last thing I want to suggest to you is maybe another kind of memorial, the one that also gave me the headline for this virtual tour. And this comes from the diary of a 12-year-old girl called Donia Rosen, who survived the Holocaust and came to Israel and worked in Yad VaShem for many years. And in her diary that she wrote in hiding in Europe, she wrote this sentence. She writes, while in hiding, I have no words, but I must write. I must. I beg of you not to forget those who are no longer living. You must avenge these deaths. I plead with you to erect a monument that will reach the heavens, so the entire world will see it. Not a statue of marble or stone, but a tower of good deeds. For I strongly believe that only such a memorial can guarantee a better future for you and your children. I think that this suggestion of Donia Rosen is a very interesting one, because maybe another way to commemorate the Holocaust, an additional way to commemorate the Holocaust, is not only in statues, but also in our values, in thinking about the Holocaust, remembering, discussing it, thinking about it, and absorbing the values that we can learn from the Holocaust survivors, the Holocaust victims, and absorb them into our values and how we live our life, how we treat people, other people today and tomorrow. These deeds, these good deeds, can also act as a memorial to all the victims of the Holocaust. So I want to thank you very much. I hope this gave you some points to think about. If you have questions, then I'm happy to answer them.
I will. Alana has asked me to read all the questions. So first of all, let me thank you, Roee. It was absolutely amazing, as was your last presentation we heard. And I know and I'm sure I'm speaking for everybody else who has ever been at Yad VaShem, no matter how many times we go to it, each time is our emotions are just as strong and our feelings are just as strong as the first time. And you really, as you said at the beginning, you didn't take us on the usual tour. You really gave us a special part of it to think about all of these people and this special part of Yad VaShem. So thank you very, very much, Roee. It was amazing. And I'll go to all the questions. And before I start the questions, Alana has written in the chat a couple times about reminding everyone before everyone starts dropping off to please make donations if you can to Julia Newman for all of the work that she does in putting together all of these programs so that we can have more speakers like Roee. And Alana did put the places where, Alana, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to say that all proceeds from today would go to Roee. So you're giving to like Julia's PayPal, but Julia is the one who helps fund the program with all of our speakers.
And we know that Roee loves us, but he also has to support a family. And just as all the other speakers that Julia brings and Julia herself, since there has not been any tourism in Israel for 2 years practically, all donations really, really help. So let me go now to the chats. I'll start from the beginning. I'm just going to read the ones that have questions for Roee. A lot of people wrote, other information about their own experiences or something, but I won't read that. So we will start with Roee's questions. When I get to the first one. Okay. Mark asks, please let me know where this number of 6 million Jewish victims comes from. I heard about a much larger number. Roee?
Actually, the question of the number 6 million is a very, very interesting question. The short answer is that nobody knows where this number comes from. Actually, just I think last year, there's been a new film, a documentary by an Israeli director about the number, how it developed, where it comes from, how did they reach this number, how did this number become such a symbol in itself. And he doesn't reach a clear answer. In my opinion, I think that it was considered, because we see people even before the Holocaust speaking about the number 6 million. Chaim Weizmann mentions it in the early 30s. I think that this was the accepted number of how many Jews there are in Europe. And immediately after the Holocaust, they wanted to say that the Nazis killed all the Jews, or almost all the Jews. So say 6 million is the accepted number of everybody. So this was maybe the origin of the number. We do need to mention that in historical research today, this is more or less the number most researchers reach. Some researchers have slightly lower numbers, some have slightly higher numbers, but we will never know exact numbers, of course.
And to further mention something about the 6 million, those of you who watch the ceremonies in Israel every year on Yom HaShoah, the torch is lit every year, and we have a special candle that's lit, 6 of them, and representing the 6 million. And a survivor always tells his or her story. So the number 6 million is used. Joanne asks, are any of the non-Jews who were murdered by the Nazis mentioned anywhere in the memorial?
It's a good question, and the answer is complex. Yad VaShem's mission is to tell the story of the Jewish victim. So generally, Yad VaShem doesn't deal in commemoration of non-Jewish victims. There are academic researchers published in Yad Vashem about non-Jewish victims, but the memorials don't really focus on it. There are a few non-Jewish victims are mentioned in the museum in a few places, but this is a very small portion of the commemoration Yad Vashem is dedicated to it.
Okay. Harry did talk about submitting to Yad Vashem names of some family members, grandmothers, brothers, and somebody else later on asked where you write to find that out. Roee, what did you mention?
In the Yad Vashem website, and just write Yad Vashem in Google, it will take you directly there. You have a section called Hall of Names, or commemorate your family members, and over there you can either search the existing database or submit witness pages for people that you know about. So you can do it online, you can do it when you come to Yad Vashem, so all the options are open for you. And if you have difficulties, you can also contact Yad Vashem and they will help you to fill out the forms and to do it. So all the options are available.
Okay, so Glauco, that answers your question. And also I'd like to add to that, a couple years ago, almost 2 years ago, at my granddaughter's bat mitzvah, she also had her bat mitzvah service in memory also of two young boys who were murdered at the ages of 5 and 6, brothers. And we got that information. We got those names and a biography of those children from Yad Vashem. So for any of you who are interested for your grandchildren or other family members, it winds up being, I'm sure most of you, when your own kids or whatever were born bat mitzvah, we used to do the Russian twinnings with the refuseniks and everything. But now this is a beautiful way to add something to the bar and bat mitzvah service. And it turns out that we found out that the person who sent the information for these two boys to Yad Vashem was somebody who lives in Israel. And so we became friendly with the family. We were friendly with this woman was the cousin of these two young boys. And we became friendly with the half sisters of the young boys. So it's an amazing way to just continue everything and to make your connection. It's an amazing program. Okay. Robin says, you're moving words about the Yom Kippur mesh exactly with my memory and fears as a young person in New York. Troubles me that young people today in the US do not understand lack of empathy and see Israel as only a stronger power. I mean, it's a comment, but do you have anything to add to that, Roee?
I think that the situation of the two great wars of Israel, the 6-Day War in 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973, are really something that shaked the entire Jewish world, not only the state of Israel and the people living in Israel. And I don't think it's a coincidence that many people who lived through either or both of these wars, here or abroad, really see it as a dividing line in their personal life and in their identities. And we can see it now from the perspective of commemoration of Holocaust. But I'm sure that every one of you who lived through this period also feel it in your life, in your perspective, in how you perceive Israel, how you perceive your identity, how you perceive your place in the world as Jews, or regardless, even if you're not Jewish.
Okay, Rosalind asks, where did Alexander Bogan settle after the end of the war?
I think in Israel, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
He's a neighbor of yours, Pam.
In Tel Aviv?
Yes. I looked it up.
Really? He lives in Tel Aviv?
He did.
Ah, okay. All right. Send me the information.
Roee, I believe I bought an apartment from your parents at 18B at 14 Koresh in Jerusalem.
No, my parents never lived in Jerusalem. I did, but not my family.
Okay. Okay, I put in something in the chat there if anyone's interested. Mark Werner, who's the president of DFI, his father wrote a book about his experiences as a partisan fighter in Poland. Excellent book, Fighting Back. Also one of the stories that Roee talked about. Let's see. There were so many people.
I can say in this context of the partisan that I forgot to mention it, but the context in which the story of the partisans comes into the radar, if we would say, of Israeli commemoration is in the late 80s, early 90s, when the mass immigration from the Soviet Union arrives to Israel, because many of these people eventually lived or either were originally from the areas of Russia or the Soviet Union, or lived the rest of their lives in the Soviet Union. So when suddenly in 1990, 1991, 1992, a mass of about 1 million ex-Soviet Jews arrived to Israel, this story suddenly comes to the awareness of people, something that not many people talked about before. So all the memoirs and books in this context are also part of this movement after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Right. And as you look through the chats, Roee, you'll see many people thank you for your amazing insight into everything and your powerful presentation. Rosalind also asks, what is the significance of the architectural design of the museum building?
The museum itself, I assume you mean that, is shaped like a triangle, also to connect to either to the Star of David or to the triangle badge that the Nazis forced on the Jews. It also gives the feeling of almost claustrophobia, where the walls are closing on you, stressing you. It's a straight line that is a very short period to go from one side to the other, but you cannot go in a straight line because some gaps in the floor are forcing you into the various galleries. It also has a glass roof with natural sunlight coming in, similar to the concept I mentioned in the Hall of Remembrance, the fact that this is not detached from the outer world. Hope can still come in. You can see the outer world. The people, the Jews in the ghettos and in the camps were not detached from the world. They were living in the world. They were seeing the people outside. The people outside could see them. And so there's a ton of symbolism in the Holocaust. If you come to Israel, I can take you on an entire tour of 3 hours in the museum, only speaking about architecture.
You're going to be inundated with people soon, Roee.
No problem.
What type of trees are planted to honor the righteous of the nations?
Nowadays, they plant all sorts of trees. There's no one tree. Originally, the first trees were carob trees, because in Jewish tradition, carob is a very important tree. There are a lot of stories in Jewish tradition about this tree being a tree that supplies everything a human needs. All the nutrition that a person needs, all the shade or everything that you need. So I have a few stories in the Mishnah, in the Midrash, about carob trees as a tree that gives life. So the idea of planting a tree, and especially a tree that is a symbol of giving life, is the reason they chose to commemorate the righteous in this way.
Okay. Mark and Maureen asked about where to contribute. Alana put it in the chat twice. She put it in there, how to contribute. And there's also an address there to send, if you don't have PayPal, to send checks directly to Steve. And he then sends the money to Julia. So it all should be in the chat. Okay. Oh, Harriet asked that also. So that's all in there. Oh, and Alana answered Harriet and gave Steve's address. A recording will be on in a few days. You look at the tiny URL. Alana, you want to put that?
Yeah, you can either go to the tiny
URL.
I actually think it's easier if you just. Sorry, can you hear me?
Go to
Can you hear me?
VFI. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. The easiest thing to do is just go to YouTube, type in Volunteers for Israel, go to the Volunteers for Israel channel, and it'll be the first or the newest upload in a few days.
Okay. Harry asks, how many names of victims of the Holocaust does Yad VaShem have? Are more victims' names being found in the various archives in Europe and the former Soviet Union countries?
Yad VaShem collects names from all the archives. So we are the only archive that collects specifically names. We use documents from different archives. We use Nazi documents. We use documents of the Jewish communities themselves from before the war. So many different sources. Today, the estimation is that we have about 4.5 million names. And this is a process that is going on, still going on. There are still new names being found, mainly from people from the public like you that come to Yad VaShem or enter the website and tell us about family members or about people you know or people whose names you came across. So you, all of you, are the source of the more and more names we find. But unfortunately, with the time that passes, chances are that we will never have all the names.
And with the time that passes, we have less and less survivors. So it's more and more important for us to keep on talking about it, and especially to the young people. Well, that's the end of the questions. You have many, many, many thank yous, Roee. Does anybody else have a question? If you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, feel free to unmute.
I have a comment I can make. That
Okay.
What Roee said about the years of silence and the recognition of the Holocaust only later, Steven Spielberg's work in recording experiences of survivors was very important. That was the only way that my significant other was willing to talk to his family, was only after that experience. So, he went many, many years keeping the whole thing within himself.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Pamela?
Esther. Yes, Esther.
Yes, I have a question. I just finished reading a book about Jewish rescuers. I forgot the name of the book. But there were a lot of Jewish rescuers who were also killed by Nazis or, died in some way or another because of that. They should be memorialized, and I'm wondering if Yad VaShem is going to consider that.
So indeed, the subject of Jewish rescuers, Jews rescuing Jews, is something that has been coming up in recent years more and more. Yes, such stories are told inside the museum of Yad VaShem. So far, there is no memorial dedicated to this subject. Like you saw, for example, in the example of the 4 heroines of Auschwitz, there are memorials to specific stories or specific issues that are related to Jews helping Jews. But so far, there is no one memorial dedicated to this subject as a whole. I assume that since this subject is very, very much talked about in the recent 2 or 3 or 4 years, I assume that it's not a long time before someone will establish such a memorial in Yad VaShem.
Anybody else have any questions? Otherwise, we can let Roee go to sleep.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this absolutely amazing presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Roee. We'll all see you at Yad VaShem. if not before, on the streets.
Thank you very much. I wish you all a good day, and
Thank you so
I
much,
hope to
Roee.
see you all soon in Israel.
And we hope
And-
to see you on another virtual tour with another subject. You're excellent.
Thanks so much,
I'd be
Roee.
happy to do so.
All right.
You can all feel,
Malako.
everyone's welcome to go. Rooe's going to sleep. If you want to stay, we have our schmooze as usual, as we do every week. Feel free to stay on and talk about whatever you feel like.
Talk about all different kinds of things. And I guess the first subject is Jerry.